Good morning, everyone. I am Rabbi Jenni Greenspan here for Beth-El Zedek's Torah Talk with Rabbi Jenni for this Shabbat morning, Shabbat Chol HaMoed Pesach, the internal Shabbat for the days of Pesach. I'm going to give us a few minutes for families and friends to log in, and we'll get started. If you don't already have it downloaded, if you go to the Beth-El Zedek website, bez613.org, go to our Shabbat resources and then the Torah Talk resources, you'll find a PDF of the Etz Chaim Chumash with today's passage for Torah reading there under the Shabbat Torah Talk one. If you have a physical copy of the book and would like to take a look, the Torah reading for this morning is found beginning on page 538 with Exodus chapter 33, verse 12. And I'll give us a couple of minutes for anyone to track that down and to join us. And Shabbat Shalom to Mickey Ashworth. I see you're on. Facebook has changed the live stream system a little bit, so it's a little harder for me to tell when folks have joined us, but I do know that since it'll record, we can always get started in about 30 seconds so that any who join us late can still jump in, or we can review the video later. Good morning to Cheryl Toof, who says you're one-armed. Oh, no. But Shabbat Shalom and good morning. Hope we're doing well otherwise. And Shabbat Shalom and good morning to Cindy. Glad to see some of my familiar faces here pretty regularly. Another good morning to Cindy. Shabbat Shalom. Mo'adim l'simcha. We're still in Pesach. And Shabbat Shalom, good morning to Jackie. It's so good to see so many joining us. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, if you either have a physical copy of the Etz Chaim Chumash, or you can download it from this morning's passage from the Beth-El website under the Shabbat Talk resources. As usual, I will point out a couple of verses here and there, but for the most part, you don't actually need to follow along too carefully. So if you don't have a copy easily, readily available, that's fine. You can go back and take a look later. Shabbat Shalom to Alan, whose birthday's tomorrow, I heard last night. So Shabbat Shalom and almost happy birthday for Alan, and Shabbat Shalom to everybody else who's joining. So I'm going to start. And Shabbat Shalom to Bernie. And I will start by saying that on some level, this Torah passage that we are supposed to read this morning, at first, when I was first looking at it, really does not make sense for this to be the Torah reading for Chol HaMoed Pesach, the Shabbat that's during the days of Passover. To some degree, it made a little more sense to me looking at it as the Shabbat Chol HaMoed Sukkot Torah reading, and it is in fact the same Torah reading that we read on both Passover and Sukkot Shabbat, the Shabbat internal to both of those longer holidays. But at first read, it doesn't actually make sense to me that this is for Passover. And so I'm going to explain that for a moment, and then we'll go back and maybe see how it actually does. So at the start of the Torah reading that we look at today, which is in chapter 33, verse 12 of the book of Exodus, we see Moses demanding of God that God show God's self to Moses. So if we run through that again, right after all of the plagues of Egypt that loomed large and were very present, and God was physical in a lot of miracles with the mighty hand and outstretched arm that we read about at our Seders. And then Moses asks to see God. And if it wasn't already pretty obvious that God was there for the people, Again, it's Moses who had been interacting with God pretty directly for most of the time that we have encountered Moses. So Moses speaks to God with a burning bush. He's been working with God to create all of the plagues. Moses is the one who earlier, right before this section of the Torah, was up on the mountain with God, getting the 10 Commandments while the people were creating the golden calf, which leads God to want to destroy them. And Moses is the one interacting with God saying, don't destroy the people. And now it's Moses who finally seems to pluck up some amount of courage and say to God, I don't actually know who you are. Please show me. So it seems kind of odd on Passover, when we have so many miracles that we have seen in the story, that Moses is asking God to show God's self. And yet God won't actually do it, at least not fully. So if you keep reading, God tells Moses that no person can actually see God's full glory and live. No one person can see all of God. But that Moses, who is on a first name basis with God, if you look at verse 17, you see that God is on a first name basis with God. But Moses can at least see God's back. And I actually prefer to translate it as God's after, rather than God's physical back, the after effects of God. And so God picks up Moses, places him in the cleft of a rock, and then covers Moses's face, and then passes by and uncovers Moses's eyes again once God has passed by. So, like I said, very weird for Passover, where we have had such a physically present God to suddenly not be so known to Moses. Might work for Sukkot. Like I said, it might work for why we would also read this passage on Shabbat of Sukkot, because on Sukkot we are working with a much more ethereal symbol. God is shelter, God is in nature, God is in the clouds of the glory in the desert. But right now, for Passover, we have just seen God and just seen how mighty God can be, and all of the plagues that God has wrought on Egypt. And so it's odd that God is only showing Moses God's back. And perhaps it is pointing to how quickly human beings, even a human being as great as Moses, can lose faith when we're living through trials, and how quickly we can forget the miracles that we've already experienced. It also reminds us that in those times of trials, we can follow Moses' example and say, God, I don't actually know who you are and what's going on. Please show me. And that is when we look for God's after. I will say right now, it could be very easy to see God in the pandemic, to think of this experience as we're trying to live through this coronavirus pandemic as a modern day plague, more like what the Egyptians experienced so many years ago. And I'm sorry, but I don't actually want us to think of it that way. I think if we think of this experience in that way, it makes us, to borrow a phrase from Rabbi Harold Schulweis of blessed memory, it makes us victims of bad theology. Because I don't think that this current experience is a plague. I don't think that God is in the coronavirus itself. I think that God is in the after. I think that God is in the way that humanity is stepping up to take care of one another. So Rabbi Schulweis suggested what he called a predicate theology. That our prayers and our Jewish practices and all of what we do Jewishly are practices to help guide us to behave in a godly way, and that God is in the godliness of human beings and the godliness that we bring into the world. So if we move forward in what is in today's passage to page 541, if you're looking at the Chumash or at the PDF, we're going to look at chapter 34, verses 6 and 7, where we see the verses that form the attributes of God. So I'm going to read 6 and 7 in the Hebrew, and most of it should actually sound quite familiar because we also use them for the Torah service, for the festivals. We've definitely heard it at Rosh Hashanah and at Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and we would be doing it on the Torah service that we would have had this past week for the first day of Pesach, where we able to have been together. So verse 6, Vaya'avor Adonai al panav vayikra. Adonai, Adonai, el rachum v'chanun, erech apayim v'rav chesed v'emet, notzer chesed la'alafim, nose avon v'fesha v'chata v'nakeh, lo yinakeh poked avon avot al banim ve'al bnei banim, al shileshim al ribeim. That middle section we've probably heard before, because these are the attributes of God as described by the book of Exodus. God is described as compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, and forgiving. And so we are given a rubric, if we're going to use Rabbi Schulweiss's description of God as our own godliness as predicate theology. We're given the rubric of how to behave in a godly way and a way to act like God. And so looking at it that way, I'm seeing a lot of God in this world right now, because we are extending compassion to one another. We're being kind and trying to keep our own stresses and angers at bay. I see God in the frontline workers caring for those who are most ill with kindness and with faithfulness. I see God in the people making their own homemade protective equipment to help ensure that the medical grade PPE is available for those who are knowingly interacting with this virus every day. I see God in the graciousness that we are using to treat our grocery employees and other essential workers who are risking themselves to make sure that we're still fed. I see God in all of us staying at home, sacrificing our time with our friends and loved ones, and forgiving our households for the moments brought on by anger of close quarters, all in order to help flatten the curve of this illness. And so I see God in a lot of us right now. So maybe with thinking of it this way, this reading isn't so out of place this Passover. It's not that we don't see God, we are shifting to a new way of seeing God. Passover this year for us, this reading is for us this year, for people living through a world-altering experience, who need to know that this experience is not the mighty hand and outstretched arm of God that we saw in the Haggadah, but rather that we are living through the experience of God of compassion and of kindness, and the God that we are bringing into the world with our own godliness. The God we are experiencing this Pesach is in the after, in our own hands, rather than a mighty hand. So I hope we continue to behave with that same kindness and compassion, with forgiveness and being slow to anger, and all of those other attributes of God and of our best selves as we move forward into the rest of Passover and into our counting of the Omer, and are looking forward to Shavuot, to Torah, and to a better future ahead. And may we continue to be God's hands in the world for the entire time from now until then. I'll say Shabbat Shalom to everyone else who's joined, to Marty and to Steph and to Margot, Steinfeld. Shabbat Shalom to Kathy. And I hope, Cheryl, I hope you heal soon. And Shabbat Shalom to Bev and to Angie, and Shabbat Shalom to everybody who's logged on, even if you haven't commented. Shabbat Shalom, Muadim L'Simcha. May we all have a blessed remainder of our Passover. And I hope you'll join Cantor Melissa at 10:30 here on Facebook Live for the Shabbat Chants Encounters, and that you'll join us on Zoom later on this evening for our community Havdalah. Shabbat Shalom, and hope you have a wonderful continuation of Passover. Shabbat Shalom.